The warm autumn air clung to the humid Mississippi River Valley like a second skin. In the small town of Westlake, Missouri, a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, life moved at a slow, predictable pace. Westlake was the kind of place where the church bell rang every Sunday morning, children rode their bikes down Main Street, and gossip was as much a part of daily life as breathing. It was the perfect picture of small-town America, nestled just north of the larger, more bustling city of St. Louis. But like many small towns, Westlake had secrets buried beneath its quiet surface. And no secret would shake the town more than the one shared between two cousins Parker and Jackson Hartley. The Hartley family had deep roots in Westlake, going back several generations. Their white, clapboard house, perched near the old train depot, had seen weddings, funerals, and everything in between. Over the years, the family's reputation had remained untarnished, marked by a hard-working, church-going respectability that few questioned. But in a town like Westlake, where conservative values ran deep, anything outside the norm was met with suspicion and judgment. Parker Hartley, 22, was the quieter of the two cousins. He had always been introspective, shy, the kind of person who seemed more at home in his own head than out in the world. After spending 4 years at a small art college in Kansas City, Parker had returned to Westlake with the hope of starting over, perhaps as a painter or photographer. Art had always been his escape, a way to express feelings he couldn't quite put into words. But his return home was not without complications, especially when it came to Jackson. Jackson, 23, was Parker's older cousin by just a year, and the two had been inseparable as children. Where Parker was introverted and thoughtful, Jackson was charismatic, extroverted, and a natural leader. He had worked as a mechanic in his father's auto shop since graduating high school, and everyone in town seemed to love him. He was the kind of guy who could fix anything, be it a car engine or a bad day, with nothing more than a smile and a few well-chosen words. But beneath that easygoing exterior, Jackson was hiding just as much as Parker, maybe more. Their bond, once purely familial, had grown more complicated as they entered their teenage years. Summers spent fishing by the river or exploring the dense woods outside town had become something else entirely. Innocent childhood affection had twisted into something deeper, darker, and much more dangerous, a love that they both knew was forbidden. In Westlake, same-sex relationships were met with disdain, if not outright hostility. And for Parker and Jackson, being cousins only made their situation more perilous. They had hidden their relationship for years, meeting in secret, always cautious, always looking over their shoulders. But Parker's return from Kansas City had reignited feelings that were impossible to contain. For him, art school had been a revelation. Away from Westlake's suffocating expectations, he had come into his own, both as an artist and as a person. He had seen a world where people could be open about who they were, where love wasn't bound by rigid social norms. And he wanted that for himself and Jackson. Jackson, however, was more pragmatic. He loved Parker, perhaps more than he cared to admit, but he also understood the reality of their situation. Westlake was their home, and neither of them could escape the watchful eyes of the town's residents. Jackson had a job, a family, a life built on the foundation of Westlake's conservative values. And he knew deep down that if anyone ever found out about their relationship, everything would fall apart. He feared not just for himself, but for Parker too. The tension between the two cousins had been building for months by the time the Westlake Harvest Festival rolled around in early September. The festival was the highlight of the town's social calendar, a weekend of food, music, and celebration that brought everyone together. It was the kind of event where people let loose, where even the most guarded secrets sometimes slipped out under the influence of alcohol and good cheer. For Parker, the festival marked a turning point. He had spent the past few weeks desperately trying to convince Jackson to leave Westlake with him. He envisioned a life far away from the small town, somewhere they could be free together. But Jackson, ever the realist, had refused time and again. Their conversations had become arguments, their once shared dreams turning into bitter reminders of all the things they could never have. On the night of the festival, Parker and Jackson were supposed to meet at their usual spot, the old abandoned barn just outside of town. It was a place that held countless memories for them, a sanctuary where they could escape from the world, if only for a little while. But that night, Parker arrived late. He had spent the evening drinking at the Copper Coin, the local bar, drowning his frustrations in cheap beer and whiskey. By the time he stumbled out to the barn, his head was spinning, and the anger that had been simmering for weeks boiled over. Jackson was already there, waiting for him, leaning against his old pickup truck. The moonlight cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the tension in his clenched jaw. "You're late," Jackson muttered as Parker approached. Parker didn't respond right away. He could feel the alcohol coursing through his veins, clouding his thoughts, making everything seem more immediate, more urgent. "We need to talk," Parker finally said, his voice slurred but determined. Jackson sighed, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. "Parker, not now. Not here." "No, Jackson. We're doing this now," Parker snapped, louder than he intended. "I can't keep living like this. Hiding, lying. I want more. I want us." Jackson's eyes darted around, as if he expected someone to be watching, even in the middle of the night. "Keep your voice down," he hissed. "Do you have any idea what you're saying? What you're risking?" "I don't care anymore," Parker said, his anger spilling over. "I'm tired of pretending. I'm tired of you pretending." Jackson shook his head, the tension between them palpable. "This is our life, Parker. We can't change it. You think you can just run away and everything will be fine. You're living in a dream. And you're living in fear." Parker shot back. "I'm offering you a way out, Jackson. A way for us to be together. Why can't you see that?" Jackson's face hardened, his usual calm demeanor cracking under the pressure. "Because it's not that simple. You think running away will solve everything. It won't. It'll just make things worse. For both of us." Parker stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper, laced with desperation. "We could be happy, Jackson. Just you and me. No more secrets, no more lies." Jackson's eyes softened for a moment, a flicker of the love they shared passing between them. But it was gone as quickly as it had come. "I can't," he said, his voice barely audible. "I just can't." Parker's heart sank. He had heard those words before, but something about this moment felt different. Final. Like the door to the life he wanted was slamming shut in his face, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "Fine," Parker muttered, turning away, his shoulders slumping in defeat. For a long moment, the two stood in silence, the tension between them thick as the night air. The distant sounds of the festival laughter, music, the occasional fireworks seemed impossibly far away, like they were trapped in a different world altogether. And then, in a split second, everything changed. Jackson reached out, grabbing Parker's arm, pulling him back toward him. "Don't walk away from me like that," Jackson growled, his voice tinged with something dark, something Parker had never heard before. Parker spun around, yanking his arm free, and in that instant, years of pent-up frustration, anger, and fear erupted between them. The argument escalated, voices rising, fists clenching, and before either of them knew what was happening, Parker shoved Jackson hard, sending him stumbling backward. Jackson's foot caught on a loose board, and he fell, his head slamming into a sharp piece of metal jutting from the barn wall. The sickening sound of bone hitting steel echoed in the still night air, and Parker's world came crashing down around him. "Jackson!" Parker screamed, dropping to his knees beside his cousin, his hands trembling as they hovered over Jackson's limp form. Blood. So much blood. Parker's mind raced, the alcohol that had once dulled his senses now heightening his panic. He fumbled for his phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he watched the blood pool beneath Jackson's head. He couldn't stop it. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but for Parker, it felt like an eternity. He stood helplessly as they worked on Jackson, their movements frantic but practiced. He wanted to scream, to tell them it was an accident, that he hadn't meant to hurt him, but the words stuck in his throat. Jackson was rushed to the hospital, but by the time they arrived, it was too late. The blow to his head had caused severe brain trauma, and within an hour, Jackson was pronounced dead. Parker was taken into custody at the scene, his clothes stained with Jackson's blood, his hands still shaking as the weight of what had happened slowly sank in. Parker sat in the back of the squad car, his face pale and streaked with tears. The flashing red and blue lights cast eerie shadows across the abandoned barn, the place that had once been a sanctuary for him, and Jackson now a crime scene. He could hear the muffled voices of the police officers outside the car, but their words were distant, drowned out by the thundering in his head. He couldn't process what had happened. It felt like a nightmare, a horrible, twisted nightmare from which he couldn't wake up. Jackson was dead, his cousin, his best friend, the love of his life, and it was his fault. The ride to the Westlake police station passed in a blur. Parker barely registered the officers talking to him, their questions falling on deaf ears. His mind kept replaying the moment over and over, Jackson's body hitting the ground, the sound of the impact, the blood. He had never meant to hurt him. How had it escalated so fast? Inside the police station, Parker was led to a small, dimly lit interrogation room. The walls were a dull institutional gray, and the air smelled faintly of stale coffee and cigarette smoke. He was handcuffed to the metal chair, his hands still trembling uncontrollably. Detective Greg Lawson entered the room, his sharp eyes scanning Parker with a mix of suspicion and pity. Lawson was a seasoned cop, one of the few who had stayed in Westlake long enough to know its residents well. He had been called to plenty of domestic disputes, fights, and even a few murders, but this case felt different. He couldn't shake the feeling that something much deeper was going on between these two young men. Lawson sat down across from Parker, placing a folder on the table. For a few moments, he simply observed the young man in front of him, his disheveled appearance, his bloodshot eyes, the haunted expression on his face. He had seen guilt like this before, and it usually didn't end well for the person feeling it. Parker, Lawson began, his voice low and measured. "You need to tell me what happened tonight." Parker looked up, his eyes hollow, barely able to focus on the detective. "It was an accident," he whispered. His voice cracked as he spoke, barely audible. "I didn't mean to. I didn't mean for any of this." Lawson nodded slowly. He had heard those words before, countless times, but something about the way Parker said it felt different. There was a weight to his words that Lawson couldn't ignore. This wasn't just about a fight that had gone wrong. "Walk me through it," Lawson said gently, leaning forward. "Start from the beginning. What were you and Jackson doing at that barn tonight?" Parker hesitated. How could he explain? How could he make anyone understand what he and Jackson had shared? The words felt stuck in his throat, trapped by years of secrecy and shame. He had spent so long hiding the truth, and now it was all coming out in the worst possible way. We were supposed to meet there," Parker stammered. "We've been meeting there for years. It was our place." Lawson raised an eyebrow. "Why meet at the barn? Why not just hang out at one of your houses like normal cousins?" Parker's breath hitched in his throat. This was it. The moment he had feared for so long, the moment the truth would come out. But now, with Jackson gone, what did it matter anymore? His life was already destroyed. "We weren't just cousins," Parker said, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes filled with fresh tears, and he had to look away from the detective, ashamed of what he was about to confess. We were more than that. We were in love." And the words hung in the air like a heavy weight, pressing down on Parker's chest. He had never said it out loud before, never admitted it to anyone but Jackson. And now here he was, confessing his deepest secret to a stranger, a police officer, in the wake of Jackson's death. Lawson sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He hadn't expected this. Westlake was a small town, and everyone knew everyone else's business, or so they thought. But this was a secret that had been buried deep, hidden in the shadows for years. And now it was spilling out, piece by painful piece. So Lawson said slowly, piecing it together. You and Jackson. You were in a relationship, and tonight something went wrong. Is that what you're saying? Parker nodded, biting his lip to keep from breaking down completely. We argued, he said, his voice trembling. I wanted us to leave, to get out of Westlake, to start over somewhere else. But Jackson, he didn't want to go. He said we couldn't, and I got angry. I pushed him, and he fell. I didn't mean to. I didn't mean for it to happen. Lawson listened carefully, his mind racing as he tried to process everything Parker had just told him. He had seen his fair share of tragic love stories in his career, but this one was particularly heartbreaking. Two young men, caught in a web of forbidden love, trapped by the constraints of their small-town upbringing, and now one of them was dead, and the other's life was in ruins. After a long silence, Lawson spoke again, his voice softer this time. Parker, I believe you didn't mean for this to happen. But Jackson is dead, and we need to figure out exactly how this all went down. The medical examiner will be doing an autopsy to determine the cause of death, and we'll need to corroborate your story with the evidence. Parker nodded numbly, his mind still reeling. The weight of what he had done was crushing him, suffocating him. He felt like he was drowning, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't find his way to the surface. Hours passed, and Parker was left alone in the interrogation room while detectives scoured the crime scene. The barn was cordoned off, and forensic teams were carefully collecting evidence, blood samples, fingerprints, anything that could provide a clearer picture of what had happened that night. As the investigation unfolded, the town of Westlake buzzed with rumors. Word spread quickly that Jackson Hartley was dead and Parker had been arrested. But the real shock came when the truth about their relationship began to surface. In a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, the revelation that Parker and Jackson had been involved in a forbidden romantic relationship was nothing short of scandalous. People whispered in the streets, at church, in the grocery store. The Hartley family, once respected pillars of the community, were now at the center of a maelstrom of gossip and judgment. Parker's parents were devastated, not only by the loss of their nephew, but by the knowledge that their son had been hiding such a significant part of his life from them. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation into Jackson's death continued. Forensic evidence confirmed that Jackson had died from a traumatic brain injury caused by his fall in the barn. But the question remained, was it an accident, as Parker claimed, or something more sinister? The prosecution argued that Parker's obsession with Jackson had driven him to violence. They painted a picture of a young man consumed by jealousy and anger, who had lashed out when Jackson refused to run away with him. They pointed to the heated arguments between the two in the weeks leading up to the incident, suggesting that Parker had become increasingly unstable and desperate. Parker's defense team, on the other hand, maintained that it had been a tragic accident. They presented evidence of Parker and Jackson's close relationship, arguing that Parker had loved his cousin deeply and would never have intentionally harmed him. They emphasized the fact that Parker had called 911 immediately after the incident, a clear indication that he had not acted out of malice. As the trial dragged on, more details about Parker and Jackson's relationship emerged. Friends and acquaintances testified, offering glimpses into the complicated dynamic between the two cousins. Some described their bond as unusually close, while others hinted at tension and unresolved conflict. But no one had suspected the true nature of their relationship, not until now. As the trial unfolded, the courtroom was packed day after day, filled with curious onlookers eager to witness the scandal play out. Whispers echoed through the hallways of the courthouse, people murmuring about the forbidden love that had led to Jackson Hartley's tragic death. Some in Westlake still couldn't believe it. How could two cousins, raised in a tight-knit, conservative family, have harbored such a dangerous secret? Others, however, couldn't hide their disgust, their moral outrage spilling into the aisles of the local church and the town square. Parker sat in the courtroom, pale and withdrawn, his eyes fixed on the floor. Every testimony, every piece of evidence seemed like a blow to his already fragile spirit. He knew what people thought of him. He could feel the judgment, the shame. His parents sat behind him, their faces etched with grief, though they never once abandoned their son. Despite everything, despite the shock and devastation, they loved Parker. But they were powerless to stop the storm that was sweeping their family into ruin. The prosecution was relentless. They combed through every detail of Parker and Jackson's relationship, using text messages and emails to paint a picture of Parker as a man consumed by obsession. They pointed to the messages Parker had sent Jackson in the weeks before his death, pleas for them to leave Westlake together, desperate confessions of love, and increasingly frustrated demands for Jackson to make a decision. These messages show a young man who was losing control, the prosecutor argued one afternoon, pacing in front of the jury. Parker Hartley's love for his cousin crossed a dangerous line. When Jackson refused to give in to Parker's demands, Parker snapped. This was not an accident. It was an act of violence born out of jealousy and desperation. The defense, however, had a different narrative. They called upon character witnesses, people who had known Parker and Jackson for years, to testify about their deep bond, their closeness. They emphasized Parker's lack of a criminal record, his soft-spoken nature, and his love for art and quiet pursuits. He wasn't a violent person, they argued. He was a sensitive young man who had found himself caught in an impossible situation. The death of Jackson was a terrible, tragic accident, nothing more. But perhaps the most damning piece of evidence came when forensic specialists testified about the scene of Jackson's death. Blood spatter patterns, the trajectory of Jackson's fall, everything seemed to point to the fact that Jackson had fallen at an awkward angle, his head striking the sharp piece of metal that protruded from the barn's decaying wall. It was a freak accident, the kind of incident that couldn't have been planned, but it also highlighted the violence of the shove. Jackson had not simply stumbled, he had been pushed hard enough to lose his balance and fall fatally. As Parker sat silently, listening to the forensic evidence, he felt a crushing weight settle on his chest. He knew, deep down, that it had been his fault. He had pushed Jackson. He had let his anger and frustration boil over in that moment, and now Jackson was dead. It didn't matter that he hadn't meant to hurt him. What mattered was that he had. The weeks wore on, and as the trial neared its conclusion, both sides presented their closing arguments. The prosecution urged the jury to convict Parker of second-degree murder, citing his growing obsession with Jackson and his inability to accept Jackson's refusal to leave Westlake. They argued that Parker's emotions had spiraled out of control, leading him to push his cousin in a fit of rage. The defense, on the other hand, pleaded for mercy. They reminded the jury that Parker had loved Jackson deeply, that their relationship had been complicated and tragic, but never violent until that fateful night. They argued for manslaughter, pointing to the overwhelming evidence that Jackson's death had been the result of a tragic accident, not premeditated violence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the jury retired to deliberate. Parker sat in his chair, numb and hollow, unable to think about anything except the moment Jackson had fallen. His lawyer sat beside him, whispering words of reassurance, but Parker barely heard them. All he could see was Jackson's face, his cousin, his love lying lifeless on the barn floor. The deliberation lasted several hours, though to Parker it felt like days. When the jury finally returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Everyone held their breath as the foreman stood, holding the slip of paper that would decide Parker's fate. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Parker Hartley, guilty of manslaughter." Parker's breath caught in his throat. Guilty. He was guilty. But as the reality of the verdict settled over him, he felt an odd sense of relief. He had known, deep down, that he would never escape this unscathed. Jackson was dead, and no verdict could bring him back. The judge handed down Parker's sentence a few days later, 15 years in prison. Some in Westlake believed it was too lenient. After all, Jackson Hartley was dead, and Parker had been the one responsible for his death. But others felt pity for Parker, recognizing that his punishment would be far worse than any prison sentence he had to live with the knowledge that he had killed the person he loved most in the world. As Parker was led away in handcuffs, he glanced back at the courtroom one last time. His parents were sitting in the gallery, their faces lined with grief. His mother gave him a small, tearful smile, as if trying to tell him that no matter what, they still loved him. But Parker couldn't bring himself to smile back. How could he, after everything that had happened? The town of Westlake would never be the same. The barn where Jackson had died became a place of dark curiosity, a reminder of the forbidden love that had torn two lives apart. Over time, the whispers would fade, and the town would move on, as small towns often do. But for the Hartley family, the scars would remain. In the end, the jury found Parker guilty of manslaughter. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, a punishment that many in Westlake felt was too lenient. But for Parker, it didn't matter. The love of his life was gone, and no prison sentence could compare to the guilt and sorrow that now consumed him.